Doctor's unusual past comes out in court after saving a juror's life. To his patients, James Lilja appeared like a run-of-the-mill doctor. But before he ever put on a white coat, he lived a much different life. As a founding member and drummer of the punk band The Offspring, he could have hit it big. Then he gave it up for medicine, having no idea he'd re-enter the spotlight, this time as a courtroom defendant thrust into an unusual position. The Offspring are known for punchy hits like Pretty Fly, For a White Guy, and Why Don't You Get a Job, but those songs, and their rise to the spotlight, came in the 90s after Lilja left. He had an earlier role in their timeline, at the band's formation. Lilja played on their debut single I'll Be Waiting and co-wrote the song Beheaded. But, after 3 years with the band, Lilja still had other dreams left to accomplish. He hadn't intended on pursuing music as a career, and he wasn't going to get sidetracked. So in 1987, he walked away. Lilja gave up the crowded punk venues for medical textbooks, as lead vocalist Dexter Holland wrote in a 2007 blog post. He was so intent on getting into medical school that he didn't really even practice with us much, which is part of why he's not our drummer anymore. Lilja earned a degree in microbiology from UCLA, then went on to the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He left school as a fully certified gynecological oncologist and settled in the Bay Area of San Francisco. Lilja opened his own practice treating pre-cancerous conditions and cancer, a far cry from his days of thrashing fans and hectic drums, though he didn't yet know he'd return to the spotlight. While Lilja has reminders of his punk past, like an occasional autograph or the drumstick stuck on his bulletin board, he might have thought his wildest tales were behind him. But Lilja was on the heels of a dramatic shift. In 2018, Lilja was the subject of a lawsuit that changed his career forever, and he also played a major role in a life-defining incident. In October 2016, a patient named Stephanie Sargiato and her husband filed a 5-page complaint against Lilja. The details of the case are not publicly known, but the Sargiatos alleged Dr. Lilja was negligent in the treatment he provided. 2 years later, they were set to hash it out in front of a judge and jury. So in March of 2018, the Sargiatos and their attorney brought their malpractice case to Alameda County Superior Court in Oakland, California. Dr. Lilja and his lawyer Barry C. Marsh were prepared for their first day of jury selection, where they probably had to weed out any fans of The Offspring. Before they could screen all the jurors, things went off the rails. It was day 2 of jury selection when things went haywire. A group of 30-plus people waited outside the courtroom, ready to see if they'd be among those chosen to participate in the trial. It's a naturally nervy situation, but for one individual, events took a frightening turn. One man among the prospective jurors faced a medical emergency. He suddenly collapsed and in the process, hit his head. Within seconds, he was lying unresponsive on the floor. Everyone around began to realize what was happening, while time ticked away for the man unconscious on the ground. The crowd of bystanders immediately took action. Someone dialed 911, while another person ran into the courtroom to alert them to the medical emergency. Pretty quickly, eyes fell to the only doctor present, but he just so happened to be the guy on trial. Lilja and his nurse assistant didn't hesitate. They rushed outside the courtroom to assess the man's vitals. He wasn't breathing and had no pulse. So, they moved right to CPR. Everyone watched as the defendant worked in rhythm with the nurse, compressing the man's chest to keep him alive. People watched with shock and concern as Lilja and the nurse worked on the unconscious man. Luckily, there was a defibrillator on site that someone quickly produced. The defendant moved right to applying the pads to the man's chest and cleared the area. Then, Lilja administered 2 shocks to kickstart his heart. Lo and behold, his heartbeat returned. Paramedics arrived on the scene to transport the man to the hospital. In the aftermath, the courtroom mood was electric. There was no other way to put it, the defendant has just saved a man's life. As you might imagine, that opened up a judicial can of worms. In the wildest of circumstances, Lilja performed one of the most heroic acts imaginable that could potentially sway a jury. Not to mention, he looked like a real pro. At a minimum, it gave him a morale boost in the eyes of the court. At a maximum, things looked bad for the prosecution. The image of the defendant swooping in as a savior was a crushing blow to the Sargiatos' case. Even without the visual, just looking at the facts of former punk drummer turned gynecological oncologist who went on to save a man's life, Lilja has a tough resume to discredit. Their attorney demanded a mistrial. Much to the chagrin of Lilja and his lawyer, Judge Ronnie McLaren agreed that the display of heroics had made the bias in that pool of jurors incurable. A mistrial was granted. Still, the defendant would eventually have to face the music, and he wasn't thrilled about it. In response to the judge's ruling, Lilja spoke his opinion aloud: "No good deed goes unpunished." Though, any other outcome wouldn't technically fall under the category of justice. Dismissing the Sargiato's case against Lilja just because he saved a life would be an unethical, controversial, but pretty punk rock ruling. Sadly for him, Judge McLaren wasn't known for making unusual calls. The judge set another trial for Lilja where a new crop of jurors heard his case without being tainted by heroics. If his case had landed in a different court, creative justice might have been granted. Instead of fines or losing licensing, some judges dole out punishments that stretch the definition of legal. It isn't outside the realm of possibility for Ohio Judge Michael Cicconetti to consider life-threatening sentences, it just depends on what the charge is. In the case of Dr. Lilja, if Cicconetti saw the defendant shocking a man's heart back to life, he would call it fair and square. For decades, Judge Cicconetti was the last person you wanted to see behind the bench at Painesville Municipal Court. The man himself won't intimidate you much, though his idea of criminal punishment is sure to send a shiver down your spine. Instead of simply sentencing his defendants and sending them on their way, Cicconetti gives them a choice. Either serve a standard sentence of jail time or be given a rather unique alternative. Thank you for watching this fantastic story. Please tap one of the 2 videos on your screen for another amazing Wonder Stories.